going to highlight two products very quickly. One, the importance of cotton raised in Xinjiang to textile manufacturing, both in China itself, but also in Southeast Asia. And the production of solar panels, which include components and raw materials that are almost exclusively sourced today from the Xinjiang area. And so you can see that this is an issue that has an important human rights component, but also a very important economic and diplomatic component as well. As Steve said, we have a fantastic panel to help us sort of figure out what the implications are. We're going to let each person give us a quick overview, understanding of important issues from their perspective, and then I really hope that we can have a conversation, including your questions, and questions that I might have for the people on the panel, as well as questions that people on the panel might have for each other. And this is a good room of good size for us to be able to have that kind of discussion. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn to Lieberthal-Rogel and ask her to give, she comes from the Uyghur Human Rights Project, and what I'm going to ask her to do is give us an overview of what exactly is happening in the Xinjiang area, why this is an important issue, and also how this issue has evolved over the past several years. So thank you very much.
And I would, if the speakers also want to see my slides, I know you'll need to, may want to move to the side. So I'm starting with the slide paying tribute. I'm starting to, first of all, say thank you all for being here, and secondly, to start with the slide paying tribute to some of the people who have disappeared or died in custody over the last 5 years of what we call the Uyghur genocide, artists, intellectuals, professors, mostly provided by their relatives who are here in the United States. So the issue of forced labor as one of the human rights issues affecting the Uyghur people, I will just point back to the year 2008. So telling you this is not new. This is my organization, the Uyghur Human Rights Project. Took a screenshot of a Kashgar government photo proudly showing the way that young women are happily going off to jobs. But we had a lot of testimony from people saying that cadres were visiting villages and using pressure, intimidation, and threats to tell them they must send these 16, 17, and 18-year-old girls 2,000 kilometers away from home. Is there anything to be done about the photos, or are you able to see what's up there? I have a lot of words on my slides. All right, I'm doing it wrong. All right, so we know that there's, starting in 2017, you really have a mass campaign of detention and destruction. Xinjiang happens to be a Chinese graduate student in Canada who just went online and used his research initiative to find out that indeed Uyghurs were telling the truth, that mosques were being bulldozed. We have evidence from reporters on the ground about the massive security uptick. And you see a streetscape that you know is from Kashgar, I mean the southern region, where it's clearly the local Turkic Uyghur architecture and the kind of surveillance. It's common in a lot of places in China, of course. But you don't have this in every place in China, where there's a population data collection form that asks about, do you pray daily? What is your religious training? Have you visited abroad? Do you have any international connections? What is your faith? And do you pray at home? Of course, we know, again, the surveillance is nothing new for anyone who studies any modern society, and certainly China in the age of COVID with the health app. But this is now going back to 2017, and a lot of data showing that some of the AI-powered innovation to be able to connect facial recognition with handheld devices and tracking was developed through the mass collection of data in the Uyghur region, so a laboratory of repression. But there was also, of course, human-scale surveillance. For those of you who are students of, early Communist Party history that and the need for everyone to watch what their neighbors were doing. So these are cadres in the homestay program taking a picture and then posting it on, where is it, on WeChat, showing that they are doing their job by living closely with the Uyghur people, but actually like staying in their houses to observe them. There's also old-fashioned things. I'm showing you right now a spreadsheet that was leaked from a local, from Karkash district in, at the county level, below the county level, where it literally is a spreadsheet. So we kind of made these skinny columns here to isolate the names so that we could have the rest. This is all their relatives, who they are, have they ever been to prison, where do they live, who are they married to, just tracking who they are, and then at the end of the document, any reasons for suspicion and reasons for detention. That was the sum and substance of why they were taken up. So the mass detentions truly were arbitrary. We have a few pictures of what people were subject to, and again, on social media, officials were happily implementing the government's policy. Foreign journalist Austin Ramsey of the New York Times in 2018 was able to say, look, this is the Hetian Jiti and so on, Hotan County, a concentrated transformation through education training center. Giant places, really, really huge, growing all the time. I don't even have any slides because there's no time. So you originally had, this was all quiet, but there was a concern. So at the UN, this was raised, and Hu Lianhe, who's in charge of United Front work and, quote unquote minority work, said there's no such thing as re-education centers. But, the evidence was too great, so they switched to saying, well, there's a problem with extremism, so we need to have vocational training. I hope you can see that, vocational training. So that's the connection between the crackdown, the terrorism, and the vocational training. So even Global Times, here in 2018, female trainees are making shoes, right? So they're working as, involuntarily. The government stuck them in there, no trial, nothing. And then it came over here, right? So in 2018, I hope people may have remembered, college campuses, as usual, often a place where people have their eyes on a situation far away in the world. This was Badger Sportswear, which licensed stuff everywhere. Sportswear traced to a Hetian detention center. This was in Australia, just getting a lot of attention. An anthropology professor, I don't know if we have any anthropology department people here. Darren Byler has just done an outstanding job. He interviewed a woman who was Kazakh, not Uyghur, who had been able to leave and talk about, being working in horrible conditions, of course, involuntarily in a glove factory, and he was able to trace it to exports to Russia and some other countries. So this was a striking headline. December 2019, there were hearings in Congress, right? Forced labor, mass internment, and social control in Xinjiang, and this is where the idea was really broached about having a law. Do we need more than just the pre-existing U.S. prohibition on the import of forced labor, prison labor, and child labor goods? And I know this isn't interactive, but for any lawyers in the legal law students in the room, I hope people know since how long it's been illegal to import any prison labor goods to the U.S. All right, Professor Luis will tell us about that. But was there a need for more? So Adrian Zenz and Nuria Turkel, who's pictured here, as well as other people were proposing such a ban. Meanwhile, of course, industry was responding. American Apparel and Footwear Association, the Fair Labor Association, which is a sort of a industry and labor rights forum for open discussion. Again, all in the fall of 2019, so 3 years ago, members of Congress, so bipartisan, Mr. McGovern is a Democrat, Mr. Rubio is a Republican, writing to Customs and Border Protection, what are you doing to make sure that the law is enforced? Then the next February, big report, Uighurs for sale. It had a lot of impact, not only because it said there's a terrible problem, right? There are terrible problems everywhere in the world. Why did this report, they listed 83 global brands that had been traced to factories that were either did have a Xinjiang address, or were using transferred labor somewhere else. And then Washington Post, I really have hats off to Anna Fifield. I know people were talking to Shannon about careers in journalism. She hung around a Nike factory in Qingdao, Taekwang Korean company, for days until she could get people to confide in her and say, yeah, there's Uyghurs here, they're under lock and key, there's a police guard who came with them, they have ideological education training sessions every year, they're forced Mandarin classes, and they can't go home. So that was direct confirmation this is happening, and this is a global brand. So finally, the Congress started, issued a big report and launched this legislation. So March 2020, and then as Professor Lean said, it was passed in the end of 2021, so it took a year and a half to pass, and then the actual implementation date is June 21st. Meanwhile, the government was not inactive. 4 departments issued a Xinjiang supply chain advisory in July 2021 at our urging of a coalition that we're part of. They issued an updated one a year later. Again, you have voluntary business responses. I think our other business professor will talk about, this kind of thing. There's an NGO coalition. We do have these statistics that Professor Lean mentioned. 20% of the world's cotton comes from the Uyghur region. So you had a big emphasis on cotton. But there are 2 other major agricultural products from Xinjiang. And so just before I cede the floor to the next speaker, I do want to talk about, after cotton comes tomatoes and tomato products. And after that, surprisingly, is red dates. So again, for Chinese studies and Asian studies, this is a delicacy, it's a tea, it's a fruit. And so what happened just recently, earlier this year, Uyghur Americans were noticing, and a Chinese American reporter and his colleague noticed that when they go into grocery stores, they were seeing red dates that had the word Bingtuan on them. So is it okay to ask the audience to tell me what Bingtuan means? Can somebody explain to non-Chinese speakers what is the Bingtuan? Yes, Professor.
The production corps of the Liberation Army that was founded in 1949-1950 to reconquer and colonize Xinjiang.
That's right. So it's Bingtuan is short for Xinjiang Shengchan. What's the middle part? 建设 Bingtuan. So it is a paramilitary militia founded in 1954 to help conquer the frontier and pacify, of course, demobilized soldiers. It had a lot of functions, but since 1954, it was basically built on prison and forced labor, right? It was remnants of the nationalist forces who hadn't gone to Taiwan. It was troublemakers who didn't get struggled against in all of the violent campaigns or other campaigns of imprisonment during the aftermath of the Civil War and the Chinese Communist Party's establishment of control over various sectors of the economy and the society. So what we were shocked now, so this photograph here on your left is an actual photograph from an H Mart. I believe that's one in Fairfax, Virginia. So we're looking at how could American supermarkets have products made by this Bingtuan, this 1954 paramilitary conglomerate. So the report came out just 2 months ago, July 26th, Sheffield Hallam University, which has a human rights lab on contemporary forms of slavery. And then, I'm just giving you this headline because it comes from another journalist, colleague of Shannon's, Bethany Ellen Ibrahim, Xinjiang paramilitary group has central role in the genocide. And it has a big agricultural production. So if we're just looking at red dates, which I told you was the 3rd largest agricultural product in Xinjiang, China produces about 1/3 of the global supply. About half of that, right, half of 7.6 is from the Uyghur region, and about half of that, a little more than half of that in 2019 was actually by this XPCC, this paramilitary group that runs its own prisons and is founded on forced labor. So that means it's about 50%. It's also intercropped with cotton, which is the industry that everyone knows about that Professor Lean mentioned. So we collected the names of the stores that produce these. We ended up with 70 different brands and packages that are on U.S. grocery store shelves. Again, for those who read Chinese, you can see Jiangnan right? So Jiang is part of Xinjiang, non-southern China, southern Xinjiang, right? Famous for its fruits. And Hong is, the red core. And then if you see it's Xinjiang. Alar. Now, Alar is a district in Aksu Prefecture, which was founded and is run by the XPCC. So any field, agricultural field, any factory, any transportation company, any business license, any hiring is going to be under the auspices of the XPCC, which, is this face labor entity. And of course, on the package, it says product of Xinjiang. So under the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, not only anything that's coming from the Uyghur region would be subject to the presumption, and in order to be imported, the importer would have to show the Customs and Border Protection that they have positive confirmation, clear and convincing evidence that it was not made with forced labor. Now, are we saying that because we found this on an H-Mart shelf in Virginia that it's forced labor goods? Well, yes, because of the Xinjiang. Was it a violation of U.S. law? Maybe not, because maybe it was imported in March, and they didn't have it together before they implemented it in the 21st. But now, before I go on, I'm going to try to not go on too long. But this presentation, starting from the report that UHRP published on August 28th, I just literally yesterday, with the researcher, a young Uyghur woman who did the research, presented this to 4 out of the 7 agencies who make up the Forced Labor Prevention Enforcement Task Force. And I will have some conclusions if I have a second, or if you ask me later what was my reaction to the questions they have to our evidence about some of the issues where they have to watch for enforcement of the law as written. So here's another example. Never mind that the little logo in the left you'll see again. Do you see what these 2 people are doing on the top of the... Does anybody study modern Chinese? What is that guy doing with that little star on his belt? Who is he? You don't have to read Chinese, you just look at the picture. Looking at the picture, you can tell who that is. He's a corpsman. So he's saluting. Of course, there's a kid saluting too, which tells you how creepy this whole settlement of Xinjiang by the Chinese unwanteds was. But then if you read it right, it is the 3rd division of the XPCC. This is a product, again, we found in a store in several stores, and it's sold online. But the source is a company in Ningxia. So if you're the Customs and Border Protection, you say, if you even get that much information, you say, well, this came from Ningxia, that's not Xinjiang. What's the problem? Because they don't read the Chinese, or this information is not available. So this is an enforcement issue. Here's another Bingtuan product, right? It's same saluting guys, same brand, Bingtuan Hong, which means red core, core red, I guess. And it says it's grown in Kashgar, which is obviously a major city in the Uyghur region. Here's another one, same little logo with the little, looks like an elongated apple with the, so there are various products. This was bought on August 7th. So, we're pointing out to the law enforcement agency, we found these in a couple of, just walking around grocery stores. We really want this not to be imported in the future. So, this is the kind of information we're providing, and I think maybe one of the topics is, how can students at University of Michigan get involved in dealing with supply chains and human rights, and I certainly have some suggestions about that as too. Thanks.
Okay, so next, thank you so much, Louisa, for that presentation. Next, we're going to invite up Professor Lieberthal-Rogel, and he's going to tell us a little bit about forced labor, modern slavery, how we think about this phenomenon, and how both the world and the United States have tried to legislate about it.
Excellent. We're good. All right. Well, first of all, thank you. And I always, from now on, I want to be partnered with Louisa on these things, because not only do we share a name, but I think that you'll see in a minute that we are a little bit of 2 sides of the same coin here. As Professor Ratner pointed out, I was a federal prosecutor for a long time and was the head of the enforcement of the involuntary servitude and slavery laws in the United States, then became the ambassador and the coordinator of the United States efforts against contemporary forms of slavery around the world. And one of the things that we were always wrestling with is that the United States has what many of the countries around the world would come at us with, which is, oh, well, you have a very particular history of slavery and enslavement in the United States, and so don't bring your issues to bear on us, don't hold us to those things. So we'd have to have a conversation about, universal human rights norms, Article 4 of the Universal Declaration, how human rights actually kind of got invented and around what issue as far as international law and practice was concerned. But what's interesting is now that I'm at the law school and I'm teaching a class with my former colleagues at Yale from the architecture school in both Michigan and Yale. Here's the pitch. It's offered as a multidisciplinary class. Graduate students from around University of Michigan can take it. We'll be offering it again next fall. It's not just for law students. But one of the things that we've been really looking at is kind of the ongoing logic of the plantation, the ongoing logic of enslavement, and what it does to the built environment. And the reason I want to start there is because in many ways we have folks who are solving for the same issue, especially if you think about the American, what we would now call the Southeast, but back then was the West, the frontier of Mississippi and Alabama. This notion of using settlement, the military, and economic exploitation of both the now cleared area, but also the people who you're bringing in to profit from, but then once you have them there, necessarily have to control them. This is a plantation that was drawn by the folks during the Depression before it totally all fell apart. And one of the things that's interesting about that is that you can see, kind of how the big house and the formal gardens blocked the access of the enslaved people and all of the production buildings from the river. The only way you got down to the river, which is where the mill was, which is where you would then process the agricultural products and get it down to market, the only way you could get past that was on this huge hill with the big house. So the big house wasn't simply status with a bunch of porticos and columns, gone with the wind, all that other stuff. It was part of a system of control. What we see in the bottom is a slave quarters. That's kind of an apartment-style slave quarters. It's about 35 feet long. It would have housed 4 small families, and they would have had access to their own kitchen space and even places to make their own food, grow their own food on interstitial parts of the monoculture plantation. Let's fast forward, because one of the things that we see is that architecture and people and business practices tend to solve for the same problem, whether it is then or whether it is now. So this is actually from Xinjiang. It's not from our area, but it was, at the time, there were a lot of folks from the Uyghur population who were actually being taken over there and put into factory situations. Again, about 35 square feet, or 35 feet, but sticking up to 45 to 48 men into those little housing units. A much more tightly controlled area where even if you have agriculture, people are being taken out to the fields, but often right there with the production facilities. And so this was actually something that the folks from a group called Who Builds Your Architecture did, which was started to look at the World Cup construction in Qatar and suddenly realized this was much bigger than just the Gulf states. And so when we started looking into this, slavery studies folks from the United States, Brazil, et cetera, looked at kind of modern China, these aerial images, and said, wait a second, I'm not a slavery person, or I'm an architect, I'm not a slavery person, but this looks really familiar. So what are we talking about? Brazil, 1600s, where you have an interlocking system. Again, the big house blocks the access of the slaves to the river. That is a plantation that is about 4,000 miles from the one that I showed you a drawing of, and halfway around the world from the things that we see in China. And yet they're all solving for surveillance, for control, and for extraction of labor, control of reproduction, and incorporation into the dominant culture by attacking language, by attacking religious practice. As true in the 1680s in Brazil or in the early 1800s in the United States as what we see now in Western China. The surveillance and control looks a lot different. In some ways it is much worse because it's not a place where you can sneak off to the woods and maintain some of your traditions. It's a place where if you sneak off to the woods, there is either somebody who is going to be reporting on you, or the ever-present cameras that we see in China. Now, I didn't mean to start off with if it's all bad, it's always been bad, let's just give up and go home, because even as we have these things that have been done by the exploiters, by the colonizers, we also have solving for the problem by the reformers, by the people who are not going to take it lying down. And sometimes those are the victimized communities themselves, and some of the times those are communities that have seen a common humanity and are willing to put it on the line. And so we look at Britain with there are more people in this room right now than there were at the first meeting in Thomas Clarkson's print shop in 1787, where they decided that they would do away with the transatlantic slave trade. It took them 40 plus years, but there were 12 people in that room. One person who had been enslaved in the past and a number of other folks who got together, and they dared to think about that. Well, one of the things that they realized was that they themselves, every time they would meet, were putting sugar in their tea. And that sugar was coming from the Caribbean. And even places we don't think of as sites of enslavement in the United States, like Eastern Long Island and Connecticut, were part of that because they were sending grain, meat, etc., as provisioning plantations down to the Caribbean. They were also sending down as many conquered Native Americans as they could find to enslave on those plantations as well. And so you end up having this kind of devil's brew of the growth of transatlantic global capitalism and global trade that ends up being fueled by enslaved labor and conquest. Folks in the UK, in one of the first kind of mass social movements, one of the first human rights interventions, started first a consumer boycott, but then ended up taking it to the point where it got to a government sanctions regime, with the Royal Navy actually patrolling the sea lanes and stopping the slave ships from crossing, cutting off the slave trade, and starting the pathway towards abolition. So at the beginning of what we now think of as international law, the Royal Navy had to say, here's how we have the right to stop all of these Portuguese ships and keep the slaves from being brought from Africa. So we're going to invent international law. This is the very simple way of doing it. My colleagues at the law school would probably jump off a cliff if they saw how reductive I'm being. You also, though, have these medallions. It looks a little ick now because it looks subservient, but this notion of am I not a man and a brother? Those medallions were made by the Wedgwood Company, and they were a big, big deal. People would wear them even on their evening gowns and things like that. And it was that notion of associating yourself with the enslaved person who was breaking his chains and standing up. And so it's the first example we have of what now would be called workers' voice, as we start to see people not as some undifferentiated thing. I'm so glad that Louisa started out with the pictures of these people as opposed to a whole bunch of numbers, because each of those numbers, each person in that number is a story. It's people who love them. It's hopes that they had. In the United States, we see the same thing with the publishing of Uncle Tom's Cabin. New technologies in being able to print books with pictures in them. Uncle Tom's Cabin is phenomenally important because for the first time, people in the North were able to see black folks as people. Folks who had never met somebody of African descent, suddenly seeing these pictures of what was happening, the humanity, the shared humanity. And if anybody ever raises an eyebrow as to the fact that the book maybe doesn't age well for our current way of thinking, why did the Southerners feel so strongly about it that they made it illegal to own? That might have been a tell as to exactly what they were afraid of. So controlling the narrative. You've got folks who are working against slavery and who are working to try to liberate an oppressed people, who are grabbing hold of the narrative by using new technologies, by basically smuggling out stories, by telling those stories. What I would argue is the invention of human rights. Human rights practice, Anti-Slavery International, which grew out of that meeting in Thomas Clarkson's print shop, then in the early 1900s, they were going around with these pictures from the Congo, showing what King Leopold's troops were doing, cutting off that man's daughter hands and foot so that they could prove that they had taken action against people who were standing up to the Belgians, and then delivering the body parts to the parents to terrorize them. Pictures like this, and I apologize for showing it to you, but pictures like this changed the world. You suddenly had people in the United States, people in Britain, presidents, Mark Twain, all these other folks coming together and standing up to Leopold, even though we needed rubber, even though we were just starting to invent cars, just as we needed gaskets. So what happens is we keep seeing this trend. We need something. It's really important. Entire economies are based on it. The economy of Northern England is based on cotton. The economy of the United States is based on selling them cotton. And everybody, this is one of those panels where everybody's wearing clothes, so that's good. Everybody depends on the textiles and the thread. But whether it's then or whether it's now, if we want our cotton more than we want a world without abuse, there will be people who will give us that cotton. So, the United States, and to answer the earlier question, there's two answers. I go with 2016, but we'll start with 1930. 1930 is an interesting year because you end up having the 1926 Anti-Slavery Convention, and you have the 1930 Forced Labor Convention in the ILO, and they are basically responding to the problems in rubber, responding to the problems of persistent forced labor in Africa and other places. And the United States passes the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930, and it immediately sets up a thing called the consumptive demand exemption, which says, except if we really need it. So you can't bring in slave-made goods except if we really need it. And the United States, despite having colonized the Philippines, did not have its own rubber or any way to get it other than the Congo, other than Malaysia, et cetera. And so therefore, strategically, rebuilding our armies, having the economy boom, the automotive industry, everything else, we desperately needed rubber. And so the Smoot-Hawley Act says no forced labor except if we really need it. It's not until 2016 that under President Obama we were able to get the Tariff Act passed that said, no, that's not good enough. We actually have the ways to prevent that. We can get out there and we can do the kinds of work that's necessary. Closing the loophole so you're no longer hampered by that. You start to have at my office at the State Department, our counterparts at the Department of Labor, within government saying we are not going to buy anything that doesn't have protections against slave-made goods. But at the end of the day, we're still dealing with what in so many ways is a voluntary compliance program. And voluntary compliance programs without a good enforcement threat behind them tend not to work. And so we ended up realizing that even with this, and this really hit home, but CBP still had to prove what had happened. Groups like Liberty Asia and others were out there in the palm oil plantations getting the dossiers so that they could take it to the customs and say, this is what's happening here, don't let it in. So what we see with the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act is flipping the valence. Suddenly we end up having, for an entire region, based on what we know is happening in China, on the basis of brave stories that are being brought out and told to the world, this rebuttable presumption. Now this rebuttable presumption is only for one place. It's only for, as a result, it's not going to reach artisanal mining in the Congo. It's not going to reach palm and rubber in Malaysia. It's not going to reach so many of these places where we have persistent problems. And yet, I think what it's done is because it's China, and because so much comes from China, we at the law school have suddenly seen all those firms that our students go to are waking up, and they are scared in a way that they were not scared in 2016. Every one of them now has, because they're trying to get business, every one of them now has a website that says, what you need to know about the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, written by people who none of us who worked on it and none of us who have actually done these cases have ever heard of. But at the law school, we're ramping up. Chavi Nana has joined us from a big firm in New York, and she was doing international compliance work. She was doing stuff on the Bribery Act and other things that are related. And so she and I and a number of the rest of us are going to be able to start helping out. What do firms need to know? Well, at the end of the day, what companies need to know is that they have to prove that this is not through forced labor. Now, to do that, they're going to need a level of insight into their supply chains that they have never had. Typically, you'd go talk to companies, and other than maybe the Body Shop and a couple of the co-op in England, which is a phenomenally proactive, it's kind of the Patagonia of English grocery stores, and it was born out of the anti-slavery fight in the 1820s. Other than a couple of companies like that, nobody really knew anything about their supply chain past 2 or 3 levels. They'd say, oh yeah, we know that guy and he's really good. Well, we don't know guys 4 through 12 and what's happening. And there would be a sectoral approach. You'd end up having a fire in a place in Bangladesh, and everybody would run out and say, we're going to do something about Bangladeshi apparel. Or we're going to run out and we're going to do something in the fill-in wherever the scandal was, Foxconn and Apple, or this or that. And it was always sectoral. This new law actually looks at this entire region and says, you know what, we know what's happening there. Now, the hope is that this risk-based enforcement that they are going to have to start taking, they are going to have to think about their supply chain in new ways. And that, kind of like California admissions laws, are so important because all the other states end up having to follow them because they're such a dominant place. What we're hoping is that companies that normally would have looked at that and said, well, I don't get Bangladesh apparel, so this, I don't have to do anything or even think about it. Now they're going to have to deal with it because China is different. So what to expect? Right now, the announcement from DHS is apparel, cotton and cotton products, silicon-based products, and tomatoes, as mentioned. And as of yesterday, the EU has announced their prohibition as well. Now, what's interesting about this, and I'll leave it with this, that is the headline from the New York Times. This has been in the works for 3 years. This has been in the works for 3 years because the EU was saying we need to catch up to the 2016 Tariff Act law. We need to catch up with what the G7 leaders have been saying for the last 3 years about this. We need to catch up with what's going on with the White House and US trade. And we want to be doing this too. We're looking at France and other places that are looking at human rights due diligence and the Ruggie principles. And so that's where this comes from. This does not come from the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act. And yet, observers immediately put it into the China context because China is different. The last thing I will say about this, the key lobbyist on this in Brussels was the lobbyist for the group Anti-Slavery International, the oldest human rights NGO in the world, the one that started with 12 people in Thomas Clarkson's print shop in 1787, the one that stood up to King Leopold over rubber, and the one that this week was able to get the attention and the ear of the EU. Hopefully, they'll be able to hear that as far away as Beijing. Thanks, everybody.
All right, thanks so much, Lou. Next, I'm going to invite Shannon Gansey to come up. Shannon is the editor-in-chief of The Diplomat, and one of the things I've been really impressed by in her reporting is her ability to see both, you know, what's happening from the
And what do I
US
press
side
to
and the
move
West
this
side, and
button?
also what's happening from the China side. And so she's going to talk a little bit about the campaigns that have been mounted against some of the boycott or sanctioning activities so campaigns have been mounted against them.
Just let it turn on her mic. First, thank you to Anne for inviting me, and to the Donia Human Rights Center and the Chinese Studies Center for hosting this event on such an important topic. As Anne said, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the response from China, but that itself is kind of a problematic term. Specifically, I'm going to be talking mostly about the reaction of the Chinese government, because that's the easiest thing to monitor and analyze. I will get a little bit into my experience of public opinion in China, but I will heavily caveat that I cannot claim to speak for the Chinese people in any meaningful sense. So my presentation actually starts from the spring of 2021. This is before the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act was signed, but it was very much in the works. And I believe that this campaign was in that way indirectly a response to it. But it was directly a response to the efforts of something called the Better Cotton Initiative, which is an NGO kind of coalition that has been signed on to by hundreds of major apparel brands, essentially hoping to improve labor conditions in the cotton industry. And they came out and said they would not support the use of cotton from Xinjiang in products from the brands that had signed on to this initiative, because it was made with forced labor, predominantly by Uyghurs, although there are also many other ethnic groups involved. And this sparked a huge response from the Chinese internet. Most of it was calls for boycotts of specific brands that had issued statements that they supported the BCI's move on Xinjiang cotton. The most prominent, I don't know if anyone can guess based on the graphic on the screen, does that resemble any logos that you may have seen? This is H&M. This was a response to H&M, which came out and said that they would not be using cotton from Xinjiang in support of the BCI initiative. The response on the Chinese internet was huge, and individual other Chinese companies took it upon themselves to sort of enforce this boycott. So even if you wanted to buy H&M products on Taobao, which is one of China's major online shopping sites, you couldn't. They were all delisted. JD.com, another shopping online e-commerce site, also blocked H&M. And some of the navigation apps, so like the equivalent of Google Maps, removed all H&M stores from their applications. So if you typed onto your map app on your phone H&M, it would say no results returned. These stores don't exist as far as these map companies were concerned. What's interesting about this campaign is it seems to have started from a specific individual. Josh Chih of the Wall Street Journal did a deep dive trying to trace it back to its origins. And the first post he found criticizing H&M specifically for this was by a sort of mid-tier Chinese influencer who had put out a post criticizing H&M for it. But then it got picked up by Chinese state media. And it got picked up by the Communist Youth League, which is obviously a subsection of the Chinese Communist Party. This particular graphic, the top says Xinjiang Mianhua. The H&M are stylized after the logo. Mianhua is the Chinese word for cotton. And then below that, the Chinese characters, that would translate to I support Xinjiang cotton. This graphic was shared by the official account of People's Daily, which is the official mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party, a newspaper, also online news site in the modern era. It has been shared 14.8 million times as of when I checked last week when I was doing this presentation. So the government did not originate this campaign, but they amplified it. And that led to, literally millions of Chinese people sharing this and plastering it on their social media. Celebrities were issuing statements expressing the similar sentiment. And Chinese businesses saw an opportunity in this. Two of the other brands that were implicated, along with H&M, were Nike and Adidas, who had both said, we are also not going to use cotton from Xinjiang in our apparel and sportswear. Their biggest rivals in China, Li-Ning and Anta, both said, we proudly use Xinjiang cotton in our apparel because we support Xinjiang cotton, we support China. Li Ning's value went up 66% in 2021, largely on the back of a huge surge in sales in China. Anta actually had been part of the Better Cotton Initiative. Li Ning never was, and it hyped up that fact in its press releases. But Anta withdrew from the Better Cotton Initiative to try and capitalize on this surge of patriotism in China. What's interesting is that now they can't sell their goods in the United States because they have so proudly and so explicitly said we use Xinjiang cotton all the time in our products. They can't sell in the US. So what we're seeing is a sort of bifurcation where companies based in the United States or Europe are saying, for their own business reasons, let's be honest, are saying our brand does not support forced labor, we will not buy from Xinjiang. Those brands face the very real risk of a major boycott in China and the loss of profit that would entail. Chinese brands are doing the opposite. They are going all in on products from Xinjiang and now being essentially banned from the United States. So this globalization trend that we have seen is kind of starting to unravel a little bit because companies are having to choose. You can't both sides this issue. You're either using the profiting from forced labor in Xinjiang or you are not. And companies around the world are having to make that choice. And unsurprisingly, most Chinese firms, because the bulk of their business is in China, are choosing to align themselves with the Chinese government on this issue. So I want to go back to the state role in this campaign and look a little bit more deeply about what the Chinese government has been saying about Xinjiang. They have, as Louisa mentioned, consistently denied that there is any problem. First, to recap Louisa's presentation, they said there are no re-education centers. That's a lie. When it became abundantly apparent that there were, in fact, re-education centers, because we could see them on the satellite imagery, they shifted to saying that these are vocational training centers. We are simply educating these people so that they can live meaningful, productive lives, which should be a familiar narrative to anyone who has studied colonial history of any empire around the world. And later it transformed to they have all been released from these detention centers. Now the question is, where did they go? Into these factories. So the assertion on the part of human rights organizations is that they are not truly free. The factories also have armed guards. Many of them are also surrounded by barbed wire. They are under constant surveillance. So just as a thought experiment, let's imagine that you were studying, you are a Uyghur student studying at the University of Michigan. You go home for winter break. You are detained. You are never told why you are detained, but you are taking classes where you have to guess why you were detained and say all the things that you think that you did wrong, and forced to repeatedly denounce your religion, perhaps your family, shown social media posts that you had issued criticizing the Chinese government, and forced to talk about how actually the party is the savior of your life. Now imagine that you are released and that in the presence of a police official, you are offered a job and told that it would be highly beneficial for you and your family to take this job. In that context, knowing that the police official is right there to drag you away back to this horrible education center that you have just spent months wishing you could escape, are you going to say yes or no to this job offer? And this is the context in which forced labor is happening in Xinjiang. And this is the model that is often used, I think, in authoritarian regimes. The line between American-style slavery and free choice can sometimes look a little blurred in a way that the Chinese government absolutely capitalizes on to try to say that these people are choosing it of their own free will. So in addition to their internal propaganda campaign, which the previous slide was an example of, Chinese government officials, and this is the Twitter account of Hua Chunying, who is the spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, have had sort of a two-pronged propaganda campaign focused on the outside world. So on the left, you can see one example. This is pretty obviously directly rebutting the idea of Uyghur forced labor. She's linking to an article in China Daily, which is the official English language newspaper of the Chinese government. You know, she is, without explicitly denying that there is forced labor happening, that is what she is saying. You know, Xinjiang cotton is pure white, solar energy is clean. Those are two industries that Xinjiang is heavily involved in and that forced labor is heavily involved in. But the tweet on the right is what is more interesting to me because she doesn't actually mention anything about forced labor. And that is very much by design. Chinese government officials and state media are basically trying to flood social media outlets with these very positive connotations of Xinjiang. They're trying to present it as a place that is beautiful. They highlight the natural scenery quite a bit. It's peaceful. It's prosperous. Everything there is going great if you look at the Chinese government tweets on this issue. And there's also been a corresponding attempt to discredit the individual researchers who have been reporting on Xinjiang, including two figures that Luisa mentioned, Adrian Zenz and Vicky Xu, who have both been doing cutting-edge research. They faced widespread personal attacks from the Chinese government attempting to discredit them. Now, to give you a sense of how important this campaign is for the Chinese government, there's a project called Hamilton 2.0 that quantifies tweets from official, so this is state media and also government official social media accounts for China, Russia, and Iran. And this is for the week of September 1st through the 7th, and August 31st, I believe, was the day that the UN released its report on human rights abuses in Xinjiang. So you can see that by far, this is the most frequently used key phrase. This is a point of emphasis for the Chinese government in its narratives. So this tells us pretty clearly the Chinese government is very invested in trying to deny that there's any problem in Xinjiang and trying to use Chinese nationalism as a weapon against foreign brands to force them to not go along with the forced labor prevention efforts. But that's the Chinese government. What about people living in China? People who are living, Beijing, Shanghai, or Xi'an. What do they think about all this? That is a difficult, if not impossible, question to answer, precisely because the discussion is so tightly controlled. If you're trying to use social media to get a gauge of what people think, any comment that is in support of the Uighurs or denouncing human rights abuses or forced labor is going to be instantly deleted. And all that is left are the comments saying, we support Xinjiang cotton. There's nothing wrong. Why is the US so hypocritical? So that doesn't mean that Chinese people don't feel those sentiments in support of their government's position. But it all certainly doesn't mean that that is an accurate reflection of what every person thinks. Obviously, you can't go to China and just do a public opinion poll on how do you feel about this issue. So there's really no way to know. So I am going to base my comments on purely anecdotal evidence when I have talked with friends and colleagues in China about this issue, which again, there has to be a pretty high level of trust to even bring this subject up with someone, particularly as I am a journalist. These are some of the answers that I have gotten. The first one is they take strong issue with genocide as a label. And I think that this is not something that's unique to China. There is an understanding of genocide as meaning mass killing of people in the sense of the Holocaust, right? If I say genocide, most people immediately think Hitler, Holocaust, Nazi Germany. The issue is that that is not the actual definition of genocide. There is a specific international legal definition of genocide that doesn't have to involve mass death. It can involve simply trying to exterminate someone's culture rather than the people themselves. But Most lay people, whether that's China or the US, don't understand that distinction. So people in China grow very upset that they're being accused of essentially being the next Nazi Germany, when in fact, no one has said that there are essentially death camps in Xinjiang where millions of people are being murdered. And that's not to say that there's not horrible things going on there. It's just that's not one of the things that the Chinese government is accused of. Something else is there's a deep distrust of Western media. And because of the media environment in China, no Chinese media is going to be able to report on this issue. So of course, all of the reports have come from international media. Louisa showcased several of the outlets that have been reporting on this. Pretty much every major one has: New York Times, BBC, Guardian, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Al Jazeera. All of them have done this. The problem is that many Chinese people instinctively distrust these outlets in much the same way that people in America might instinctively distrust China Daily, because they see it as Western propaganda. And this is a line that is often raised by the Chinese government, that China is being unfairly targeted and that human rights is just an excuse to attack China and to keep it down. But that line resonates with a lot of Chinese people. A lot of people that I have spoken to do believe that their country is unfairly targeted, it is unfairly criticized, and that there are elements of racism and imperial suppression lingering from the old colonial days when China was being carved up by foreign powers at play in what's going on today. So even though that is a Chinese government line, we can't just dismiss it wholesale. We have to really wrestle with the idea that Chinese people might actually believe that. There is also, and this is very interesting, a reluctance, if not an outright refusal, to acknowledge that China has a problem with systemic racism, which really what we're talking about is the culmination of a massive systemic racism problem that sees Uyghur ethnic identity as a problem that needs to be solved. And most members of the Han Chinese majority ethnic group that I have spoken to, again, caveating that, don't see that. They don't think China has a problem with racism. And the way that they dismiss the idea of racism is very similar to the way people in America dismiss the idea of racism. They will sometimes point to what we in the US might call reverse racism. They'll say, no, you don't understand. It's actually the Han Chinese who are oppressed, because the Uyghurs, they get extra points added to their college entrance exam scores, and we don't get that, so we're the ones who are oppressed. And the Uyghurs, back during the days of the One China policy, they were allowed to have 2 or 3 children, and the Han Chinese weren't. Isn't that so unfair to us, the majority Han Chinese? And they would take those own examples of what they perceive to be unfair against them and use it to negate the experience of someone who is saying, I was jailed, my brother was jailed for essentially no reason. My parents are disappeared, I don't know where they are. Essentially equating those two experiences. Then there's also what I would call the Uyghur friend defense. You will hear this often in America. People will say, well, I have a black friend, and she says that racism is not a problem, and sort of putting your words into the mouth of someone who's from this, supposedly from this oppressed group, and letting that person who agrees with the majority opinion speak for the entire minority group. So I just want to point out that issues of racism and denial of racism are not at all unique to Chinese society. This is obviously an issue that we in America are struggling mightily with as well, and some of the psychological defense mechanisms that people in America have evolved to deal with it are also at play in China, and people are just sometimes outright dismissive of the idea that a Uyghur in China might experience any oppression. So this has been sort of a depressing presentation, but I do want to point out that we can make a difference. And to do that, I want to talk in my talk by traveling a little bit further to the west to talk about Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan had a huge problem with forced labor, basically telling people that they have to go work in the cotton fields whether they want to or not. And there was a long-standing boycott. That boycott was just lifted earlier this year because human rights groups found that Uzbekistan was no longer using forced labor. So it is possible to make a difference. Now, China is not Uzbekistan. It's going to be much more difficult for the world to live without China's cotton than Uzbekistan's, but it is possible.
We are running a little long, and so I want everybody to know that if you need to step out, please don't feel bad about doing that. I'm also going to invite you quietly, if you want to go get something to drink or move to grab something from the reception table, please feel comfortable to do that. But the presentations today are just, I hope you feel the same way, just have a ton of content and are really interesting, and I sort of hesitate to shut them off before people get to speak. And so our last presenter today is Ravu Anupindi, and he has a lot of information for us, not just about the supply chains in the world and how to think about Xinjiang in the context of those supply chains, but also about what we at the University of Michigan might be doing to respond. So thank you.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Steve, for this invitation. And it's a hard act to follow with the three of these distinguished speakers speaking on, laying the groundwork for what's really happening in this particular region. So I'm going to take a slightly, hopefully my comments will be value add for you. The word supply chain came up. Supply chains are complex. As I tell my class, if you follow the product from you as a customer buying anything and what happens further upstream, all supply chains end up in Mother Nature, either under the ground or on top of a tree or in a water, right? That's where it all ends up. The problem with that complexity is the further upstream you go, you begin to lose traceability of that material. If you want to know where your spinach came from, it's super hard to know, right? Because there are so many different farms that produce the spinach. So as you move from end products, which you and I will buy, unless some of the examples you gave, package, if it's food product coming in, that's a whole different thing, right? But if it's an assembled product or, say, a T-shirt or shirt, it's very hard to know where the raw material came from, right? So that's the challenge. That is, you lose traceability. You can trace a product, you can trace some components, then it gets to materials. It becomes very, very fungible at that point in time. So that's the complexity that we have to kind of keep in mind as we try to begin to trace supply chains and ask companies to say, you need to trace all the way back to the raw material. It's a challenge. I'm not saying it's not doable, but that's a challenge, right? Second, I was looking into it, just trying to see, I don't know, we showed pictures, et cetera. How big is this region? It's half the size of India. It's as big as Alaska. It's huge. It's a huge region and a source of many. So you heard cotton, you heard solar panels, right? You heard tomato and other kind of ag products. And they have a large market share on that. One other thing that you haven't heard, which I picked up, was PVC. So if you're remodeling your home with some fancy PVC kind of stuff, 50% of all PVC comes from China. And Xinjiang region accounts for about 10%. And they're really cheap. And they're cheap because there are two aspects. There is forced labor aspect, but there's also a lot of energy, subsidized energy that goes into anything that is very high energy intensive. There is a lot of coal in this region, et cetera, coal burning plants. So you have those combinations that are going on if you go through many of these regions. You mentioned about XPCC or Bintuan, right? They are big, right? They own and operate about 14 publicly listed companies, right? And they have as many as, holdings in more than, 800,000 holdings they have. And they are 30% of, they grow 30% of all of China's cotton. So it's huge. Now you take cotton, one, you can trace direct exports. So we have DWRO, et cetera. You can trace direct exports, and CBP can say, did it come from Xinjiang or not? But a lot of the cotton goes to other suppliers, primarily, for example, Bangladesh, right? And if you ask them, where did the cotton come from? Well, it's not clear, because Xinjiang region also sells cotton on a wholesale market in an auction. It's super hard to know where that cotton came from and which cotton did it get mixed with and ultimately showed up in an end product. So that's the traceability challenge that companies will have to deal with, right? You mentioned about solar panel supply chains, right? So solar panels, 7 out of 10 solar modules companies, top 10, 7 out of top 10 are in China. And about 3 of them are in that Xinjiang region. So our green economy could be built on forced labor, as simple as that, right? So that's another challenge that we are facing. And you mentioned about tomatoes, same issue, right? Some products, as you showed pictures, you can identify, but other stuff, it goes in various complex supply chains and ends up here. It's super hard to know where was that tomato grown, right? Just like if you ate something in the dining halls here based on tomato sauce, you don't know if it came from what kind of labor. You have no idea, right? I mentioned chemicals and PVC. That's another big area. And China accounts for a large fraction of it. So that's the context here, right? So what can we do, right? You mentioned about universities. So, and you raised about Fair Labor Association. So let me just back up a little bit. In my title, as you introduced, I chair the advisory committee to our president on labor standards and human rights. Anything that you buy at M10 that gets the Michigan logo comes under that purview. Because as a university, we worry about labor conditions under which these products were produced. That is, indirectly, are we as universities complicit in lending our brand name to products that were, quote unquote, unethically produced? So that's an advisory committee. Our operational mandate is around ensuring that whoever we are licensing our logo to, whether it is Nike, Adidas, or the company that licenses, honors labor standards and human rights in their supply chains. No university has internal capacity to monitor supply chains. They just can't develop that capacity. So we work with 2 organizations. We work with Fair Labor Association, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative. And this is probably the only initiative that I know where a large collective of universities have come together, more than 140 universities. I know of no other organization where these many universities have come together. So there are universities that have harmonized around this issue. We require all our licensees to be members of the FLA, and FLA has standard principles about responsible sourcing and all that stuff. We also work with another organization called Workers' Rights Consortium, right, which is also based in DC, and they are much more focused on, I mean, not that FLA is not focused, FLA does much more than simply investigations, but WRC is doing much more targeted investigations if issues come up, right? So we as a university work with both. Now, I also sit on the board of the FLA, and in its 20-year history, so this was set up during the Clinton administration, FLA has never told companies about banning a specific country or region. FLA doesn't get into that business because they say, here are some of the general guidelines you have in terms of responsible sourcing. And I think, as was mentioned, that this is the first time, we are not talking about a sector, we are talking about a region. And the reason we are talking about a region rather than a sector is, you can talk about a sector if there is a way to investigate. If there is no way to investigate in a particular area, then you have to blanket the region. There is no other alternative left, and that's where we end up here, right? So for the first time, FLA in its 20-year history has given this, they basically made a statement, given the high risk of forced labor and overwhelming evidence of human rights abuses and multiple layers of government sanction, the FLA is prohibiting sourcing and production, including direct and indirect sourcing of raw materials, inputs, and finished goods from Xinjiang region. The first time FLA has said that, and is expecting all its member companies to begin to trace and honor this. That then applies because all of our licensees are also FLA companies. So it indirectly applies to all of our licensees. But there is a challenge there. If you look at, say, MDAN, You can buy lots of different products that get the Michigan logo. 5 companies account for 80% of the volume, which means we have a long tail of really small and medium licensees. If you go ask them, Xinjiang, I said, what is that? I don't even know. And even if they're aware of it, they can't do anything because they are buying from some other large company. So the expectation of transparency hits a wall because those other suppliers of these licensees or suppliers of those licensees are not members of FLA. So you begin to hit a wall there in terms of how do you ensure that what you're buying is not coming from that region, right, for the smaller companies. For the large companies, you can hold them accountable, right? Now, so indirectly through WRC also we work, and WRC also has notified all the licensees that, this is not acceptable. And now it's not WRC saying, because it is now illegal based on the government mandate that has come in. Now, I checked with the University Caucus board members of the FLA about what they have done in their respective universities, and Liz Kennedy from UCLA, she's said that what they have done is they have also met with all of their vendors, at least to begin to inform them that this is an issue. First of all, do you know if this is an issue? Many of the vendors don't even know this is an issue. At least begin to inform them this is an issue, right? That you have to take some responsibility and ensure. And ensuring is a difficult thing because then to ensure that anything from that region is not in your supply chain requires traceability, and traceability is supremely hard to do. Not that it can be done, but it is hard to do, right? So that's one piece of the thing. The other challenge that happens, and I think it was mentioned that there is transfer of forced labor. That's super difficult, right? Because somewhere in your supply chain, even if you're not getting your product from your region, you trace it to that region saying, I have nothing coming from that region, there is transfer of forced labor happening to other regions. So indirectly through that transfer, your product might have been made by forced labor. And that is also not according to the labor standards and human rights that we have, right? So that's the other challenge. And in fact, if you read the latest news, Nike is getting a lot of pushback on that. And Nike is pushing back saying because activists are asking Nike to completely disengage from China. Not just Xinjiang region, completely disengage from China. That's super hard, right? So it is being touched. I'm just saying that this is a challenge that we face. I sit on the agricultural committee of FLA because FLA is also doing a lot of work in ag space. And, for example, Nestle would say, yes, we have traced our supply chains. We get nothing from that region. But we can't go public, like we talked about the H&M, et cetera. We can't go public for a very different reason. China is known to retaliate. We have factories in other parts of China. It's not just about my selling a product I produce in China, even if it produced for Chinese market or other markets. What do I do? Because as a government, there could be retaliation, as you gave examples from the tweets, et cetera. So that's where we see the challenge, right? So it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do anything. We should, and as a university we should, as citizens we should. But there's also another role of financing companies. Trace the money. Who's investing where, right? So let me give you one example here in terms of tracing the money. International Finance Corporation, right? About $500 million of International Finance Corporation's loans and equity investments are in 4 companies that operate in this region. Many US companies have subsidiaries that have investments in these regions. So if you talk to them saying, they'll wash their hands off saying, no, we don't have. Well, no, your subsidiary in Malaysia has an investment somewhere there. So I think one missing link when we think in terms of it's not just product supply chains, it is the money flow supply chain that you have to look at. Who's investing where? So all I'm getting to is that when we look at, not just in this area, I teach a course on environmental and social responsibility in supply chains. Same thing in palm oil. It comes up. You have to look at the banking institutions. What are the different pressure points that you could apply? It is activists, consumers, brands, but there's also financing companies. So that's another area to kind of think about, how we could bring about pressure to for change. And last point I would make, just what you highlighted, I think that's another tricky piece. You said globalization in something, what are the Chinese companies' response, et cetera. And that's the tricky piece, right? Because, yeah, I mean, we can say we shut it off, but, the last I checked, I think 2012 was a watershed moment when the world's GDP, if you look at the fraction of world's GDP between OECD and non-OECD countries, 2012, more than half the world's GDP has shifted to non-OECD countries. If you draw that as a percentage share, it's an X, and it crossed over in 2012. It's not coming back. That's not coming back. So yes, not that we shouldn't put pressure from US and EU, but there is another market out there. I mean, just look at Russian oil. Who's buying Russian oil? I mean, we could put all the bans, but Russia is still making money through selling oil. So there's all those other countries that will still do, source from Xinjiang and other regions. I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. But that's the challenge we are kind of dealing with, right? So let me pause here, and of course, there will be some time for questions, et cetera. Yeah, thank you.